Hiya, I'm Phil, and I'd like to tell you one of my favourite stories about one of my favourite characters. Now, this story is very old. If you think of the oldest person you know, then this story is older than them. It's older than their parents, it's older than their grandparents, it's older than their great-grandparents, it's older than their Look, it's quite old, but I'm sure you know some of it already. Because this story is part of a Norse myth, and that means it's the type of story that the Vikings would have known. Now, the story takes place in a land called Asgard. Now, Asgard was a magical realm where all of the Norse gods and goddesses lived, and it was joined to our world by a rainbow. The main character in our story, you'll know already. His name is Thor, and he is the god of thunder. Now, Thor was really big. He was really brave, and he was very strong. He had long red hair and a big red beard. Now, he was loyal, but he wasn't the sharpest in the bunch. I'm sure you know Thor had a magic hammer, and this magic hammer could change shape, and if Thor threw it, it would always come back to him like a boomerang, and if he hit something with it, everyone heard the thunder. Thor was very proud of his magic hammer. Now, one morning, Thor woke up. It was a beautiful day in Asgard. The birds were singing, the sun was shining, and Thor had a long, deep sleep. He yawned, he stretched, he opened his eyes, and he realised something wasn't right. Now, Thor's bedroom was normally a mess, but it was so much more messy than normal. He looked down and there seemed to be goat poo in his slippers. But worst of all, his hammer wasn't on the bedside table. Thor panicked. He jumped out of bed. He had to find his hammer. He looked under the bed. Hammer wasn't there. He went through his toy box. Hammer wasn't there. He looked under the cushions on the sofa. Hammer wasn't there. But he did find the remote control for the telly, so that was good. Thor thought hard, and that wasn't something he did well. Whenever he'd lost things before, all the other gods would say, well, where did you see it last? But that just made him cross. If he knew that, it wouldn't be lost, would it? No. His hammer wasn't lost. It must have been stolen. But who would dare to take Thor's mighty hammer? The tiny cogs in Thor's tiny brain went round. Oh, Loki. I bet Loki's got it. Now, Loki was one of the other gods who lived in Asgard, and his main skill was to make mischief. He liked to play pranks and jokes, and generally make a nuisance of himself, so he was suspect number one. Thor charged round to Loki's house, and rather than tapping on the door, he just knocked the thing off its hinges. "Loki!" he cried. "Where's my hammer?"
Oh, good morning, Thor. Do come in. I was just enjoying a dippy egg. What seems to be the problem?
Thor explained. He knew Loki had stolen his hammer and he'd come to get it back.
Well. I have not taken your hammer. Now, where did you see it last?
Thor began to break things. Now, for once, Loki was telling the truth. He hadn't taken Thor's hammer, and once he'd calmed down, Loki said he'd help Thor to find it. They just had to ask the other gods if they'd seen it. First of all, they decided to ask Freya. Now, Freya was the most beautiful of all the gods in Asgard, and when they got to Freya's beautiful house, she was enjoying a facial and a pedicure.
Oh, where did you see it last?
She asked when she heard Thor's hammer was missing. "I've not lost it. It's been stolen," said Thor.
Interesting,
said Freya, and she lifted a piece of cucumber from her eye.
I heard there were some giants in Asgard up to no good. Maybe it was them.
Everyone gasped. Giants in Asgard? Well, that was impossible. You see, there was an old, wise god called Heimdall, the Watcher, and it was his job to be a lookout over Asgard and make sure everyone was safe. If the giants had got past Heimdall, they must have used powerful magic. His eyesight was so good he could see an ant from 200 miles away. His hearing was so good he could hear a ladybird trump. And his smell was so good he could sniff out a giant hiding in a perfume factory. Something didn't make sense. Loki volunteered to go and spy on the giants, and he borrowed Freya's magic cape. This cape was made of feathers, and if you put it on, you turned into a bird. So Loki turned himself into a bird and he flew off the many miles to the land of the giants. Took ages to get there. Hours and hours of flapping, and when he finally arrived, Loki was exhausted. So he settled on a branch of a tree for a little rest. He was just drifting off into a nice snooze when he was startled awake by the sound of laughter The laughter was loud, it was deep, and it was very, very pleased with itself. Loki hopped over a rock and looked down, and there he saw Thrym, the king of the giants, and he had tears of laughter rolling down his face.
Hello, Thrym, king of the giants,
said Loki, turning into his human form.
What's so funny?
Now Thrym liked Loki because he was always up to no good. Hello, Loki, said Thrym. Thing is, we broke into Asgard last night. We went to Thor's gaff, and we stole his magic hammer. He laughed for ages.
That's interesting,
said Loki.
Did you use powerful magic to get past Heimdall?
Oh no, said Thrym. We just waited for him to go for a toilet break, and then we snuck in when no one was watching. See, we expected a fight, but we got to Thor's house, and the mighty Thor was sound asleep. He was even sucking his thumb. So we messed up his bedroom. We jumped on his bed. I put goat poo in his slippers, and we took his magic hammer. As we were leaving, we heard the sound of thunder, and we got scared because we thought Thor had woken up. We got ready for a scrap. But when the thunder was followed by a flush, we knew Heimdall had finished and we'd better leave. I've hidden that hammer 8 miles underground, and you ain't getting it back.
Oh,
said Loki.
Well, there must be some way of getting it back. Maybe we could trade. I could give you gold, jewels. I could make sure your name lives on in stories for hundreds of years.
Thrym laughed. I don't need gold or jewels, and stories are a waste of time. You can tell Thor I will give him his hammer back if Freya, the beautiful Freya, agrees to be my wife. Loki, he flew back to Asgard to give Thor the good news that he'd found the hammer, and the bad news that he was never going to be able to get it back. That's good news, said Thor. Freya marries the giant, I get me hammer back. Bosh!
Bad news,
said Freya.
There's no way I'm going to marry a smelly giant. Sorry, boys, you're on your own.
And she skipped off to her Zumba class. Thor was very upset. They held an emergency meeting of all the gods to figure out what to do, but no one had any good ideas. And then Heimdall spoke. Now he was very keen to redeem himself after being caught short and caught out. And his idea was simple. It was brilliant. And Thor hated it. Heimdall suggested that if Thor disguised himself as Freya, he could pretend to marry the Giant King and just take his hammer back. So that's what they did. Poor Thor didn't know what hit him. He was shaved, he was waxed, he was plucked, he was tweezed, he was threaded, he was coiffed, he was dyed, he was tinted, he was bleached, he was painted, he was made up. He was squeezed into a wedding dress, and they put a heavy veil over his face so you could just see his eyes, and he was passed off as the most beautiful creature in the world. Loki disguised himself as Thor's servant, and they jumped into a chariot and headed for the land of the giants. It took a while to get there, and by the time they got to Thrym's castle, it was really busy. The whole of giant high society had gathered for the wedding feast. Now there were some giants there who were very vain, and they were jealous of Freya. They wanted to be the most beautiful creature in the universe and marry the king. They wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Now as they sat down to the wedding feast, Loki turned to Thor and in a low voice said,
Listen, Thor, you've got to remember you are the most beautiful, elegant, charming and polite woman in the world. If we get rumbled, we'll both get eaten by giants. Is that clear?
Easy peasy, said Thor. How hard can that be? And that's where the fun really started. You see, as the food was brought in for the wedding feast, Thor realised he was really, really hungry. And he started to grab the food that went past and stuff it into his veiled mouth. There was some beef and some chicken and some sausages and some cheese and some cake and some spaghetti and some pizza all going into Thor's mouth, and then he stopped and realised everyone was looking at him. Here, what's going on? Said Thrym. Loki thought fast.
Oh, my Lord Thrym, he said. The Lady Freya has been so nervous about meeting you. She's not eaten for 8 days. She's very hungry. Besides, it's very fashionable in Asgard for everyone to eat that way.
Oh, said the giants, and they threw their knives and forks on the floor and started to eat with their hands, chomping and slurping as Thor had done. "I'd like to make a toast," said Thrym, "to my wife-to-be, who really is the cutest thing I ever did see." That made Thor really cross. He began to shake with rage, and his eyes went bright red with anger. He shot Thrym a look, and Thrym fell back into his chair. Loki thought fast.
My Lord Thrym, the Lady Freya has been so nervous about meeting you, she has not slept for 8 days. That's why her patience is a little thin, and her eyes are all red. Besides, it's very fashionable in Asgard for people to have red eyes.
Oh, the giants nodded, and then they started to poke themselves in the eyes, happy to follow fashion. The feast was going well. Thor had eaten, he'd drunk, and he was very pleased he'd soon get his hammer back. He leant back in his chair, he sighed, and he let out the longest, loudest, most tuneful trump the world had ever heard. Everyone stopped and looked at Thor. Loki thought fast.
My Lord Thrym, he said, the Lady Freya has been so nervous about meeting you, she has not passed wind for 8 days, no. Besides, it's very fashionable in Asgard for everyone to show their pleasure after a meal by letting off a little toot.
He'd barely finished the sentence when the hall was filled with the sounds of trumps and pumps and toots and poops and guffs and fluffs from all the giants trying to be fashionable. Ooh. The wedding feast was finished, and it was time for the marriage. Thrym had a certain magical hammer brought into the hall as a gift. "Now, my dear," he said to Thor, "we just need to seal this marriage with a little kiss." And he closed his eyes, he puckered up, and he leant into Thor. Thor looked at Loki. Loki looked at Thor. Loki nodded. Thor grabbed his magic hammer, and he gave Thrym, the king of the giants, a kiss he wasn't expecting. Thor ripped off his veil and his wedding gown, and dressed only in his underpants, he set about beating up all the giants. It suddenly became very fashionable to run for your life. And that is the story of how Thor lost and then found his hammer. So I suggest, before you put your slippers on next time, just make sure there's no goat poo in there, won't you?